While the early deists were busy reconstructing Christianity, at the same time being very careful to avoid the accusation of atheism, the world of science had been steadily progressing. The Copernican view of the universe may have convinced the freest thinkers, but even with the support of Kepler and Galileo, it seemed mathematically flawed, and no one really knew how it was supposed to work exactly until, as Alexander Pope famously said,
"Nature and nature's laws lay hid by night. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light."
As with so many slogans of this sort, Pope's famous couplet, of course, is an oversimplification. But Isaac Newton's theories about gravity and about the laws of motion certainly made it impossible now for intelligent men to adhere to the earth-centered universe that the Catholic Church was still so insistent about. Whatever man's role was in the great scheme of things, it was now impossible to think of it as being, well, literally center stage. Now, the extent to which Newton's Christianity differed from Anglican orthodoxy didn't become fully apparent until his previously unknown religious writings were discovered in the last century. But it's now quite clear that his scientific achievements were closely related to his religious convictions, and that he was convinced that God revealed himself in words just as much as he did in creative acts. It seems that two patterns are emerging when it comes to the role of science in the history of disbelief. One which we've already seen when we were looking at Copernicus and Galileo. It's that most of the scientists involved, and that included Newton, remained firm believers, either in spite of, or in most cases, actually because of their science. Well, the second pattern is to be seen amongst people who are not actually scientists, intellectuals and in some cases theologians, who found it quite easy to reconcile the new scientific discoveries with their belief in the existence of an omnipotent being. The Reverend Samuel Clarke, for example, arrived in Trinity College, Cambridge, shortly after the publication of Newton's Principia. In 1704, he was invited to deliver one of a set of lectures which Robert Boyle, one of Newton's most distinguished colleagues in the Royal Society, had instituted to establish the truth of the Christian religion against infidels. Clarke's first series of lectures were entitled A Demonstration of the Being and Attributes of God, more particularly in answer to Mr. Hobbes, Spinoza and their followers. Like many of his 16th century predecessors, Clarke identified three distinct classes of atheists. There were those, as he said,
the stupid and ignorant, who have never made any just use of their natural reason to discover even the plainest and most obvious truths.
Then there were those who,
by vicious and degenerate life, corrupt the principles of their nature, and are resolved not to hearken to any reasoning.
And finally, there were those who were both moral and reasonable, whose own speculations had convinced them that the atheist position is more strong and conclusive. And it's the third group that contains, as Clarke says,
the only atheistical persons to whom the present discourse can be supposed to be directed, or who are indeed capable of being reasoned with at all.
Now, in contrast to Descartes, the French philosopher of the previous century, for whom the most significant argument in favour of God's existence was the fact that he was to be found as one of the indubitable ideas in our mind, in other words, that we simply knew of his existence, and since we had that knowledge, it must be God-given, Clarke, like Newton, referred to the objective evidence of celestial mechanics. And like many authors, before and after, Clarke also invoked biology as evidence of intelligent design.
The late discoveries in anatomy and physics, the circulation of the blood and the exact structure of the heart and brain bear insensible marks of conscious contrivance.
Well, in spite of its apparently rigid logic, The religious conclusions which Clarke arrived at don't necessarily follow from the mechanical evidence which he cites. Like Newton, after all, he was a pious Christian, predisposed to visualize nature as the expression of omnipotent intelligence. So that, in an important, unavoidable sense, the arguments which he develops are in the service of, well, a foregone conclusion. All the same, the fact that a mathematically literate clergyman had so little difficulty in reconciling Newtonian mechanics with the notion of a supreme being goes to show that the conflict between religion and the increasingly mechanized picture of the natural world has been seriously exaggerated. As we've already seen, ever since the Reformation, there's a sense in which the road to atheism was paved not with science, but with religious intentions. The efforts of deists such as Hobbes to create a more reasonable form of religion had unknowingly helped to forge the very weapons that would eventually be turned against the whole idea of religion. Hobbes lived out the last years of his life here in the elegant home of the Devonshire family, whose children he had tutored. But there were a great many of these so-called deists in England, which incidentally was sufficiently tolerant to allow these gentlemen, and it's very important to realize that most of them were gentlemen, to freely express these ideas. But I'd be here for another 4 programs at least, if I were to do justice to names such as Shaftesbury, Bolingbroke, Toland, Tyndall, Anthony Collins, all of whom in their various ways were trying to identify something that was common to all religions, some primeval origin of them. However, although many of them are significant, there's one giant who's perhaps the most significant philosopher in the English language to have expressed these deist notions, and who in fact, although he never admitted himself to be an atheist as such, he was clearly and unarguably the most vividly elegant and eloquent skeptic of them all. I'm referring, of course, to the great Scottish philosopher David Hume.
I have always considered David Hume as approaching as nearly to the idea of a perfectly wise and virtuous man as perhaps the nature of human frailty will allow.
David Hume was born in 1711, 32 years after the death of Hobbes. He went up to university in Edinburgh at the age of 12 to study a degree of his own devising. By the age of 20, he had already travelled to France and had begun to write his treatise on human nature. Whereas Hobbes assumed that man, in what he referred to as the state of nature, was a dangerous creature who therefore needed some sort of social structure, possibly supported by religion, to restrain his selfishness, his violence, and his greed, Hume was something less of a pessimist. But his own skepticism about religion nevertheless handicapped his academic career.
Generally speaking, errors in religion are dangerous. Those in philosophy are only ridiculous.
Thought to be too subversively atheistic, he was actually denied the chair of moral philosophy at Edinburgh University by the clerics who still decided upon such appointments. After all, at that time, all universities were religious foundations. Certainly, in his dialogues concerning natural religion, a work which his friends considered so provocative that it was not published until after his death, Hume does deliver a devastating criticism of conventional belief.